Hi, in this video we're going to do a very brief introduction to building interactive web applications in R. So the package that we're going to learn about for this is called Shiny, and Shiny basically makes it easy to build interactive web apps straight from R. You can host standalone apps, which is what we're going to be working through today on a web page, or you can also, with the syntax of Shiny that you learn, embed these interactive pieces in Markdown documents, the types of documents you've been working with, or build dashboards with them too. And if you know more web programming, you can actually extend Shiny with things like CSS themes to change the look of your app, with HTML widgets to add further interactivity to them, or even with JavaScript as well. So if you want to learn more about Shiny, the best place to get started is the website shiny.rstudio.com, and we're going to do a very brief overview in this video as well. At a high level, what's happening is that every Shiny app we build basically has a web page that the user visits, and behind this web page, there's a computer that serves this web page by running R. So as your user is interacting with the app, that computer is running the R code necessary to make the changes that the user sees. When you're running your app locally, the computer serving your app is basically your computer. And when your app is deployed, the computer serving your app is a web server. So what do I mean by that? Here's an example Shiny app, and this is what we're actually going to build. You can go play along with this app at the address that's given on top. And it's one of the visualizations that we've seen previously in this week's videos. And this is the daily sentiment scores. And what we can do here is we can add some interactivity with it, where I'm basically changing the country or the origin from Scotland to UK. And we can see that the graph changes along with it. I can also change the month range that I am plotting. So if we do this, let's take, we're not in December 2020 yet, of course. So let's say, what if we were to start at October, so we can see the graph change accordingly. We've also added additional kind of interactivity to this app as well, where you, when you hover over the points, you can see the values in them. And basically, as the user is making changes, like playing around with these widgets, we're seeing the changes reflected in the output. We can also do certain selections and focus on things as well. And all of this we're doing using R. So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to dive into the code that was used to build this app. So I'm going to now turn my attention to RStudio and do a little bit of coding for you to start with the visualization that you've already seen and make it interactive with Shiny. So here's our original plot that we're going to be working with, and we have the code available for that for us. And the app that we're trying to build is basically that plot, but in a way that we can change some of the parameters for it interactively. So what do we see here? We have our plot, and one of the things that we're going to need is these widgets that are going to be used by the user for selecting the country or selecting a date range. And then we also have this hovering functionality on the app that we're going to need to build in as well. So how do we build one of these Shiny apps? So each Shiny app is made up of two parts. It has a UI, which is the user interface, which is basically what your user sees, and a server, which is where the R code, the R code that fuels the app really lives. The user interface is basically what makes that web page, and hence should really be HTML code. But we're not going to be learning how to write HTML code here. Basically, one of the things that the Shiny package does is it takes your R code and translates it into the appropriate HTML code. So once we read our data, we're going to need to create a UI, which is our user interface, and a server. And then we put these two pieces together using a function from the Shiny package called Shiny app. So let's start with our UI. Our UI will have some information about how we want to lay out our page. So one of the things that we want to do here is when you build a web page, you might want to think about who is going to be viewing it on and on which sort of device, and how wide will their window going to be. If their window is going to potentially be narrow, you want to make sure that you account for that somehow. And one of the ways of doing that with Shiny is using the fluid page layout, which basically what it does is as your window gets narrower, it knows how to place particular objects. Before we do this, I should also load the Shiny package. That way I get the autofill as I'm typing things. If we go back to our plot Shiny app here real quick, we can see that in our layout, we have a sidebar, and then we have basically a main panel where we have our plot. And in order to be able to get that look, we're going to use a layout called sidebar layout, which is, there are other layouts as well, but that's kind of like a standard look for a Shiny app, a simple one. So that's what we're going to use. And in there, we have a sidebar panel and, oh, this should say panel, and a main panel. So that's what our Shiny app will have, a sidebar, in the sidebar layout, a sidebar panel and a main panel. And you can see that I've separated these using commas. It's basically this whole like definition of the Shiny app, of the user interface side of the Shiny app is almost like one giant list where you place things that you want to be shown to your users when they land on your app. And on the server side, the server side is basically a function. It takes an input and it spits out an output, and we're going to say a little bit more about what those mean in a second. And finally, to create the Shiny app, we use the Shiny app function, and we basically say take the UI that I defined and take the server that I defined and put them together into an app. And another thing that I want to do here is I want to make sure that my R script ends with that call to the Shiny app. So I'm going to comment these out and then save my document. And you can see that as soon as I did that, the icon here has changed to say run app, which basically this is RStudio recognizing that what we have here is a Shiny app, and so it's going to run it. To save a little bit of time, I'm going to, for a second, hold off on loading that data set, and let's go ahead and run this app. A really, really simple layout. You can see this like gray here, this gray box here, which basically is that sidebar, but we're not seeing anything in there. And then we also have some space for the main panel as well. So let's go back to what we were trying to make. We can see that we also have a title that says Scotland and UK COVID-19 speeches. So let's go ahead and bring that in. That is going to be our title panel. And it says Scotland and UK COVID-19 speeches. And let's reload our app. Oh, okay. Try this again. Oh, okay, so error sourcing something. I have an error, and in fact, I'm seeing that the error is here as well. I just said this is one giant list. It needs to be separated by commas, so I need to put a comma right after that. A very common mistake when you're developing Shiny apps is to forget those commas. All right, so I have my title here as well. Then what I want to do is I want to start adding these widgets in. So I have a widget for a drop-down menu and a widget for a date range. So in order to, let's start with the drop-down menu. So that's going to be in the sidebar. And in Shiny, there's a function called select input. So something input functions are all these widgets that your users can interact with. They always start with an argument called input ID, and that's going to be basically what your app knows the value of that widget to be internally. And they usually also have a label. This is what your user sees. So I can say select origin, and the two choices are two things. So I'm going to put them in a vector, Scotland and UK. So let's save this and reload our app. We can see that we actually have a widget here now. It's functional in the sense that I can do things with it, but it's not functional in the sense that it's not affecting anything else that's going on. So now let's go ahead and try to bring that plot back in here, okay? So the code for our plot was right here. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. And let's go ahead and cut this out. We want to end our app with a call to the Shiny app function. And on the server side, I want to place this plot. But my plot needs to be not that static plot, but a reactive plot. It needs to react to the user's choices. And in Shiny, the way we do this is there are, just like there are something input functions, there are also functions that start with the word render. So in this case, I want to render a plot, and I want to say that this is the render plot needs to go, needs to go in here. Okay, so this is what should make it a reactive plot. Let's go ahead and reload our app to see what happens. Nothing really. There has been no change. So why is that plot not showing up on my app? Because on the user interface side, I still haven't said where to place that plot, right? So whatever your user sees on the user interface side has to be explicitly defined over here. So I want to say that I want to place this plot into my main panel. Well, if I want to place it into my main panel, I need to give it a name. So anything that is calculated on the server side that ultimately needs to be shown to the user on the user interface side needs to go into a list called output. And I am going to call the name of this plot sentiment plot. I can really call it whatever I want, but I want to give it some short name with no spaces in it that is, that actually says what it is. And then I want to be able to say you should put this plot here. But Shiny needs to know how to call that plot. So we have a function called plot output. So these are a series of something output functions. So it could be table output, plot output, text output, stuff like that. So in this case, plot output. And really the name of the argument here for completeness is output ID. So you can see the parity between, or the symmetry between output ID and input ID. Your user selects an input that needs to get passed down to the server. And then the server side calculates an output that gets passed back to the user interface to be shown to the user. Let's stop this and run this app again. Let's see. Oh, we are using a data set that we haven't actually loaded. So I'm going to actually go ahead and load this here as well. And it's going to take a second for this to actually load because that's a large data set. Remember, that's all the words. And so what I have now is the plot is showing up. But the thing is, when I make choices, the plot is not changing. And that's because we haven't yet told Shiny how to use the user's selection on the plot. So currently in the plot, the origin is hard-coded to be Scotland. But really what we wanted to say is it's whatever the user has chosen. And that means that we want this to be input $Scotland. Or sorry, input $origin, which the current value of that is Scotland. So let's go ahead and try this one more time. And so now we have a link between our user interface and our server function. If I now make it selection, I can see that the plot updates according to it. The plot is updating, but the title of the plot is not updating. So I need to do one other thing here. So let's go ahead. And so I need to replace this word Scotland with input origin as well. I can make a glue statement out of this and say that this is going to be input origin. And let's go ahead and reload our app. So now when I select UK, not only is the plot changing, but its title is changing as well. Now, if we go back to our our goal with this, we also need this date range input as well. So let's go ahead and add that too. So that's going to be another widget Let me stop this from running in the background. That's going to be another widget. This time we're calling it a date range input. So it's always something input. In this case, it's date range input. It needs an input ID, and I will call that date range. The label is what the user sees. So that was select date range. And then we need to determine where it should start by default. That should be whenever our data starts. So that should be the minimum of the date column in this data set. Not data, date. And then the end should be the maximum. Go ahead and remove that, and we can see that RStudio is telling me, hey, you forgot to put a comma between these two things, so let's go ahead and do that. And this time, let's not fall into the same trap of creating an input widget, but then not reflecting the choice from that on the server side. So I'm going to now think about how does this need to be reflected on the server side, so when the user changes the dates, we can actually see the plot change as well. Well, I'm filtering for a particular origin. I should also filter for a particular date. And actually it is not a single date, but it is, we have two endpoints for our date. So I'm going to use the between function from dplyr and say date between input. So this was called date range. The first the output of that is going to have two elements. One of them is the beginning of the date and the other one is the end. So we are saying between the first and the second, and then we'll add this onto our pipeline. And let's go ahead and run this app again to see where we are. Okay. I can see a date range widget actually showing up. That's a good start. Now let's see if it's actually functional. I will pick a date, say, how about we start at July 1st? And in fact, I can see my plot being recalculated and the graph has changed as well. So now we have a functional date range input widget too. The last thing we had on our app was when you hovered over the points, we were seeing the values of them. And that actually is not a Shiny functionality per se, but it comes from a different package called Plotly, which is an interactive data visualization library. So let's go ahead and say Plotly. We're going to load that. And what we want to do is we want to turn this into a Plotly plot that is interactive, which turns out to be a pretty simple task because what we need to do is the plot that we create, I'm going to save it with some name, really doesn't matter what name you use, and then we're going to say turn that into a ggplotly plot. The one other thing I need to do here is that Shiny needs to know that what is being developed here is not just a plain plot, but it is a Plotly plot. So this needs to say RenderPlotly. And similarly, over here, it's not a table or text output, but it's not a plain plot output either. It's a Plotly output. So when you're using the Plotly package, we also have Shiny functions that correspond, that know how to work with these Plotly outputs. So now our visualization should also have this additional functionality where when I hover over things, I can see the dates. And if I actually do things like selection, it's another way of zooming in. The one thing is over here, when I am hovering over these, the information looks quite busy. Really, probably all I want to know is the date and the sentiment score. I don't need to know that sentiment is greater than 0. It's obvious. So what you can do as a last customization for your plot is we can actually say that is called a tooltip when you hover over things, which aesthetics from the plot, so those are the aesthetic mappings, should be represented here. And really the ones, this is a vector of the aesthetics. I want the X and the Y, the date and the sentiment score. I don't want the coloring aesthetic, which tells us whether it is a positive number or a negative number. So let's go ahead and run that too. And to review things while that's running, our Shiny app is comprised of two components, UI, which is the user interface, Oh, it didn't like something. What did you not like? Oh, I put this in the wrong place. So this is not going to go in the UI, but instead that should go where I am actually defining my ggplot. So let's go ahead and try that again. So the Shiny app has two components: the user interface, which is where you lay out what your user sees. This is actually HTML code under the hood, but what the Shiny package is doing is taking your R code and translating it to HTML code. And then we have the server side where you can see a lot more code that you had previously developed there. So we actually started with this plotting code that we had developed previously and simply replace some of the hard-coded elements in it with input something, which the inputs are actually things that come from the user interface with your user's selection. And then whatever we develop on the server side, if it's something that needs to be displayed to your user, it needs to be appended to a list called output. So those names, input and output, are not flexible. You always have to use those. But what you call the elements that you do develop, so your plots, your tables, your text, whatever, you can call them whatever you like, as long as you're keeping track of what you're calling them, because you're always calling these things in two places. You develop it in the server, you display it in the user interface, or your user makes a selection in the user interface, you use that selection in the server. So we're always doing this thing where there's a loop between the UI and the server, and this information is being passed back and forth. Some of the things that we haven't touched on here are things like we're working with a large data set, and when we make these selections, and we're also doing somewhat expensive calculation, right? We are working with this large data set, doing a join and whatnot, and we can see that when we make changes to our plots, there's a little bit of a lag in things kind of changing, but this is all quite addressable. We could do a better job in terms of refactoring our code so that not everything is recalculated every time your user touches it. We would want to think about what are some things I can calculate ahead of time and simply use, regardless of whatever my user's selection is. But for the purpose of this lesson, we're not going to go there and worry too much about kind of the performance of your Shiny app. But we have at least been able to show you that learning one new package and building on what you've learned so far, you're able to turn your static visualizations to interactive ones. And it doesn't need to be limited to visualizations. We could also add other sorts of output or text here as well, and we could build this full-fledged interactive app.